Hi, I think you're part of a healthy debate in challenging some commonly held assumptions we have. What I'm wondering, though, is in your choice of starting with the Bible, which, as you know, is subject to many different kinds of interpretations, and as you admit, is not a science textbook. You mentioned your own conversion to Christianity as a result of reading the Sermon on the Mount, which is very moving, but again, did not come about as a result of scientific thought. So when you're trying to make ties between religion and the scientific community, I guess it seems anathema to the scientific method to start out with the conclusion and not generate the conclusion as a result of evidence. So just your comments on that, please.
That's a great question. That's a fair question. And to respond to your second question, I think what was your second question first, I would never argue that simply from the facts alone that you're going to wind up having a conversion experience, or that's all there is to embracing the Christian faith. There really is, in my view, a religious experience that we all, as believers, engage in, that there is faith that we are exercising in the way that everybody understands the word faith to mean. But it's not to say that that faith can't be grounded in fact and in reason that gives some substantial foundation to making that leap of faith, if you will. So I think it's faith and reason working together that's very much part of a conversion experience and of the Christian life. But a fair point that you're making. Secondly, with regard to your question about using the Bible as a starting point, again, a fair question, but what essentially we're doing is we are making the assumption that what the Bible is teaching has validity, has some merit, or has some truth to it. Then what we're doing is, once that assumption is in place, testing that assumption, and that's what the creation model is about. Now, that is not really an anathema to the scientific process, and I can give you an example where that type of assumption was essentially used in quantum mechanics, or a similar type of approach was used. For example, there's the well-known Schrodinger wave equation that this German physicist Schrodinger developed, and it's essentially treating quantum mechanical phenomena as waves. Now, he didn't derive that equation from first principles. He basically said, it looks to me as if these quantum phenomena are behaving like waves. I can take classical wave equations and quantize them and produce these quantum wave equations, the Schrodinger equation, that I can then solve, and I make predictions based on the solution as to what should be discovered. He essentially assumed that this is the way things behaved. Then he tested it. And the predictions that he made turned out to be valid, which means that we can then cycle back and say there was validity to those original assumptions, that he was onto something, but he didn't have data initially indicating that there was any reason necessarily to demand that be the case. It was an assumption that he made, but he then subsequently tested the assumption, and that's what we're doing as well, is we're making assumptions, yes, but then we are testing those assumptions. And if our tests turn out to be valid, then maybe our assumptions have validity.
Brief follow-up. You mentioned the Bible has some validity. I would agree, but it seems like you're not just saying that, you're saying the Bible has a specific and exact validity. There was one man, one woman, choosing among the myriad of interpretations. How do you have that as the bedrock of your theory?
Well, that's our conviction at Reasons to Believe is that is the best way to understand and interpret the Bible, and so therefore we're positing our model based on what we think is the best way to understand it. But it doesn't mean that other people can't produce their own models that would compete with our model. And what we're trying to do with this approach is say, look, we don't have to get into these rancorous debates about these issues. Let's approach this in a methodical way where we would basically say, this is what we think is true. How can we then evaluate that theologically? How can we evaluate that scientifically? And again, the idea would be that we would take our model and then stack it up against not only Christian models, but also against evolutionary models as well. So it's essentially trying to model an approach. And so I'm not necessarily saying ours is the only approach or even the best approach. It's the approach that we have chosen, but then we're willing to evaluate that and try to come up with ways to establish our approach as being legitimate.
Would you say, Fuzz, I think that he asks a great question related to that, because there's so many people who are scientists who would say, I won't grant you that presupposition that the Bible is basically a valid place. But when you take a look at things inductively, the evidence that you pointed out, I think you had 9 points on there of predictions that would possibly come true, such as that the genetic evidence points to one man and one woman all the way at the beginning. Now, you don't have to assume the Bible is true in order to come to that conclusion. Science would drive you to that same conclusion. Is it possible, from somebody who comes from a non-Christian or non-theistic perspective to begin putting those pieces together just based on the scientific evidence and begin moving in that direction? What would you recommend for someone who's in that spot?
Well, you could definitely do that, but the point that we're raising with this creation model approach is that by doing that, you very well may lock yourself into only going down a path of mechanistic, materialistic explanations, that the genetic data indicates, this mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam, and this recent origin of humanity. But if you essentially could easily wind up in a position where you lock yourself into only a single class of possible explanations, and you may never discover the truth. Rather, you're just simply trying to account for things from a naturalistic, materialistic standpoint. And so what we would argue is that bringing our approach alongside that approach perhaps opens up the options where we have a greater chance of discovering what indeed is true. And it may be that at the end of the day, the evolutionary explanation is more robust than our creation model. And then at that point, we need to deal with that. But that's kind of the idea.
It might be the other way as well. And
it might be the other way as around. Yeah.